The radio crackled with static as the merchant vessel Liberty Dawn wallowed in the grey Atlantic swells, her hull groaning under the weight of 10,000 tons of war material bound for England. It was March 23, 1943, and 20-year-old merchant marine cadet Casimir Novak stood frozen at the radio operator's station, his calloused fingers hovering over the transmitter key. Through the porthole, he could see the white wake of a periscope cutting through the dark water just 300 yards off the starboard beam. The U-boat had been stalking them for 6 hours, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But Casimir had a different plan, one that would violate every rule in the Merchant Marine Handbook and risk court-martial if it failed. He was about to send a distress signal that wasn't distress at all, but bait. His heart hammered against his ribs as he began tapping out the Morse code that would either save his ship or doom them all. The message was simple. SOS. SOS. Engine failure. Dead in water. Abandon ship. It was completely false. The Liberty Dawn's engines ran perfectly, her boilers hot and ready. But somewhere beneath those frigid Atlantic waters, a German submarine commander was about to receive the most convincing lie of the war. No one aboard the Liberty Dawn knew that one cadet's audacious deception that morning would rewrite the tactics of convoy protection and save thousands of merchant sailors' lives. Casimir had grown up in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, where his father Stanislaw worked the blast furnaces, and his mother Maria kept house for 5 children in a cramped row home on the south side. The Novak family had emigrated from Poland in 1921, carrying little more than their work ethic and an unshakable belief that America rewarded those brave enough to take risks. Young Casimir inherited both traits in abundance. As a boy, he'd spent hours at the Allegheny River docks watching the coal barges and freight steamers navigate the murky water, dreaming of distant ports and open seas. His parents had hoped he'd follow his father into the mills, but when Pearl Harbor shattered America's peacetime dreams on December 7, 1941, 18-year-old Casimir knew his destiny lay on the water. The merchant marine offered a path to serve his country without waiting for the draft, and the pay was better than anything Pittsburgh's factories could offer a Polish kid from the wrong side of the tracks. The United States Maritime Service had established training stations across the country to meet the desperate need for qualified mariners, and Casimir enrolled at the academy on Hoffman Island in New York Harbor just 3 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The training was brutal. 16-hour days of seamanship, navigation, radio operation, and gunnery practice. Many of his classmates washed out in the first month, unable to handle the physical demands and technical complexity of modern maritime warfare. But Casimir possessed an intuitive understanding of radio technology and an uncanny ability to think 3 steps ahead of any problem. His instructors noticed something special in the quiet Polish-American cadet, who seemed to absorb knowledge like a sponge and never complained about the workload. He graduated in the top 5% of his class and received his first assignment to the Liberty Dawn in January 1943. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation. The Battle of the Atlantic had become the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, stretching from September 1939 through the war's end. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes like wolves, sinking merchant vessels faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. By early 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz's submarine fleet had sent over 3,000 Allied ships to the bottom, claiming more than 72,000 lives and millions of tons of crucial war supplies. The mathematics of destruction were staggering. For every U-boat sunk, the Germans eliminated an average of 14 Allied merchantmen. American Liberty ships, mass-produced in Henry Kaiser's revolutionary shipyards, were being launched at the rate of 3 per day. But even this industrial miracle couldn't keep pace with the slaughter in the North Atlantic. The convoy system offered some protection, with destroyers and corvettes escorting groups of 30 to 50 merchant vessels across the ocean. But the escorts were spread thin, and the U-boats had developed new tactics. Wolfpack attacks overwhelmed convoy defenses, and the submarines' ability to dive deep and disappear made them nearly impossible to track once they'd fired their torpedoes. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Britain's survival depended on these supply convoys, and every shipment that reached Liverpool or Glasgow brought the Allies one step closer to opening the second front in Europe. The German submarine service understood this perfectly, which is why they fought with such desperate ferocity to cut Britain's lifeline. For the men aboard ships like the Liberty Dawn, every voyage was a deadly game of cat and mouse played across thousands of miles of empty ocean. The odds were simple and terrifying. 1 in 4 merchant mariners would not survive the war, making them statistically more likely to die than Marines storming Pacific beaches or bomber crews flying over Germany. Convoy HX229 had departed New York Harbor on March 18, 1943, carrying 43 merchant vessels loaded with tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and food for the British war effort. The Liberty Dawn held position in the convoy's center, her holds packed with 5 Sherman tanks, 2,000 rounds of 75mm ammunition, and enough aviation fuel to keep a fighter squadron airborne for 6 months. Casimir had drawn radio watch duty for the 4 to 8 morning shift, monitoring the convoy commodore's frequency and maintaining contact with their escort vessels, 4 destroyers and 6 corvettes, spread in a protective screen around the merchant ships. 3 days out of New York, the convoy had encountered its first U-boat contact when HMS Volunteer, a British corvette, detected submarine propeller noises on her sonar. The attack came at dawn on March 21st, when U-628 fired a spread of torpedoes into the convoy's rear echelon, sinking 2 freighters and damaging a tanker. The escorts counterattacked with depth charges, but the submarine escaped in the confusion of burning ships and scattered escorts. That afternoon, long-range reconnaissance aircraft from Iceland spotted at least 6 more U-boats converging on the convoy's position, setting up what naval intelligence would later call a controlled wolf pack attack. By evening, the merchant ships were steaming through a gauntlet of submarines, changing course every 20 minutes, in a desperate attempt to avoid the deadly torpedo spreads. Casimir monitored the radio traffic with growing dread as ship after ship reported periscope sightings and torpedo wakes. The convoy commodore's voice grew increasingly strained as he ordered emergency turns and speed changes, trying to keep his charges alive long enough to reach the air cover that operated from bases in Northern Ireland. Sleep became impossible as the sound of depth charges echoed through the ship's hull, and every man aboard the Liberty Dawn understood that their survival depended on staying alert and ready to abandon ship at a moment's notice. The young cadet found himself thinking about his parents in Pittsburgh, wondering if they'd ever learn what happened to their son if his ship simply vanished into the Atlantic's cold depths. The crisis reached its peak on March 23rd, when dawn revealed that the convoy had lost 12 ships during the night, including their lead escort destroyer. HMS Bramble, the senior corvette, had taken command of the remaining escorts, but her captain signaled that fuel shortages would force him to reduce speed and abandon the convoy within 18 hours if they couldn't reach the air cover operating from Reykjavik. Casimir was monitoring the radio when he intercepted a transmission between 2 U-boats, speaking in clear German, less than 10 miles from the convoy's position. His 2 years of high school German, studied to please his immigrant parents, suddenly became a matter of life and death as he translated the submarine commander's coordination of their final attack. They planned to surface simultaneously and use their deck guns to destroy the remaining escorts before finishing off the merchant vessels with torpedoes. It was a tactic that had worked devastatingly well against previous convoys, and the U-boat commanders seemed confident that nothing could stop them from completing the destruction of HX229. The Liberty Dawn's captain, a grizzled veteran named Morrison, who'd survived 3 previous torpedo attacks, gathered his senior officers in the chart room to discuss their options. Abandon the convoy and make for Greenland. Continue with the escorts and hope for rescue aircraft, or perhaps try to outrun the U-boats by pushing the ship's engines beyond their design limits. Each option seemed to guarantee failure, and the tension in the chart room was thick enough to cut with a knife. That's when Casimir knocked on the door and requested permission to speak privately with the captain. What the young cadet proposed in the next 5 minutes would violate every established protocol for merchant marine operations and risk the lives of everyone aboard their ship. but it also offered the only realistic chance of survival for the remaining 27 vessels in the convoy. Casimir's plan was audaciously simple and completely unauthorized by any maritime regulation or naval doctrine. He proposed using the ship's radio to broadcast a false distress signal, claiming engine failure, and announcing that the crew was abandoning ship. The deception would hopefully lure the nearest U-boat to the surface, where it would be vulnerable to ramming or gunfire from the escorts. The risks were enormous. If the Germans realized the deception, they might torpedo the Liberty Dawn immediately, killing everyone aboard before they could escape. If the plan worked but the ramming attempt failed, the submarine would almost certainly sink them in retaliation. Most dangerously of all, broadcasting false distress signals violated international maritime law and could result in court-martial for everyone involved in the deception. Captain Morrison studied the young cadet's earnest face for a long moment, weighing the probability of success against the certainty of destruction if they did nothing. The captain had served in the merchant marine for 23 years, and he'd never heard of anything like what Casimir was proposing. But he'd also never faced a situation this desperate. With submarine wolf packs closing in from 3 directions and his escorts running low on fuel and depth charges, the mathematics of their situation were brutally clear. Conventional tactics would result in the destruction of the entire convoy within 6 hours. Morrison made his decision with the characteristic decisiveness that had kept him alive through 3 years of convoy duty. He would authorize the deception, but only if Casimir personally took responsibility for broadcasting the false signal and accepted the legal consequences if they survived long enough for a court-martial. The young cadet agreed without hesitation, understanding that he was volunteering for either a medal or a firing squad, depending on how military justice viewed his actions after the war. The preparation for the deception required split-second timing and absolute coordination between the radio operator, the bridge crew, and the engine room. Casimir worked with the chief engineer to develop a convincing story about catastrophic engine failure that would explain why a healthy Liberty ship had suddenly become dead in the water. They decided to claim that a steam pipe had burst in the engine room, scalding several crew members and forcing an emergency shutdown of the main engines. The story was plausible because such accidents had occurred on other vessels, and it would explain why the crew would need to launch lifeboats quickly. The ship's gunners were quietly briefed on the plan and ordered to remain at their stations despite any appearance of abandoned ship procedures. If a U-boat surfaced to investigate their disabled vessel, the gun crew would have only seconds to engage before the submarine could dive again. Meanwhile, Casimir practiced the distress call until he could deliver it with perfect authenticity, complete with the stammering panic of a radio operator, reporting a genuine emergency. The bridge crew rehearsed their roles in the deception, preparing to shut down non-essential electrical systems and alter the ship's profile to simulate serious damage. Everything depended on selling the performance to U-boat commanders who had seen dozens of genuine ship sinkings and would be suspicious of any signal that seemed too convenient. The German submarine service had developed sophisticated techniques for distinguishing real distress calls from Allied deception attempts, and one false note in Casimir's performance would doom the entire convoy. As the young cadet returned to his radio station at 7:15 on the morning of March 23rd, he carried the lives of nearly 1,500 merchant sailors and naval personnel in his hands. The weight of that responsibility should have crushed a 20-year-old kid from Pittsburgh's steel mills, but Casimir felt only crystal-clear focus as he began the most important performance of his life. At 7:28 that morning, Casimir began transmitting the false distress signal that would either save the convoy or destroy his ship. His finger tapped out the international distress call with practiced precision. SOS, SOS, SOS. This is Liberty Dawn. Position 49 degrees 30 minutes north, 38 degrees 15 minutes west. Catastrophic steam pipe failure in engine room. Multiple casualties. Dead in water. Preparing to abandon ship. Require immediate assistance. The transmission was repeated every 60 seconds for 7 minutes, broadcast on both the international distress frequency and the German submarine monitoring channels that Casimir had identified during his radio intercept operations. Throughout the ship, crew members played their roles with convincing desperation, launching empty lifeboats on the port side, while keeping the starboard boats ready for genuine evacuation if the plan failed. The engine room crew reduced power to minimum levels and vented steam through the funnel to create the appearance of serious mechanical problems. From a distance, the Liberty Dawn looked exactly like a ship in genuine distress, wallowing dead in the water with her crew preparing to abandon her valuable cargo to the Atlantic. The performance was so convincing that several merchant vessels in the convoy began altering course to offer assistance, forcing Captain Morrison to break radio silence and order them to maintain formation. The tension aboard the Liberty Dawn was unbearable as minutes passed without any visible response to their deception. Casimir continued broadcasting the distress call, varying the message slightly each time to maintain authenticity, while the ship's lookout scanned the horizon for any sign of a surfacing submarine. The gamble was enormous. If no U-boat took the bait, they would have revealed their position for nothing and invited torpedo attack without gaining any tactical advantage. But if the deception worked, they would have the opportunity to strike back against the submarines that had terrorized merchant sailors for nearly 4 years of war. The response came at 7:41, when a periscope broke the surface 600 yards off the ship's starboard quarter, followed seconds later by the distinctive outline of a Type 7C U-boat, rising from the depths like a grey whale. U-419, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Kleist, had been stalking the convoy for 18 hours and saw the disabled Liberty ship as an opportunity to capture valuable intelligence about American shipping before finishing her off with gunfire. The submarine's sleek hull emerged completely from the water, her conning tower streaming with seawater as her deck crew scrambled to man the 88mm gun mounted forward of the sail. For a terrifying moment, Casimir thought the Germans would simply torpedo the helpless ship from underwater, but submarine commanders had learned to conserve torpedoes whenever possible, using deck guns against disabled vessels to save their precious fish for targets that could fight back. The U-boat's presence created exactly the opportunity that Casimir had hoped for, a submarine on the surface, vulnerable to ramming attack or gunfire from the escorts that had been quietly maneuvering into position throughout the deception. HMS Bramble, the senior corvette, had understood the Liberty Dawn's plan through careful observation of her supposedly panicked crew, and Lieutenant Commander Pierce had positioned his ship for a high-speed ramming attack the moment the U-boat surfaced. But the distance was still too great, and U-419 would have time to dive again before the corvette could reach ramming position. Everything now depended on keeping the submarine on the surface long enough for the escorts to close the gap, which meant continuing the deception even as German deck gunners prepared to blow the Liberty Dawn out of the water. Casimir keyed his microphone for what might be his final transmission, broadcasting a message that would require every ounce of acting ability he possessed. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Liberty Dawn. German submarines surfaced alongside, preparing to board us. Do not approach. Repeat, do not approach. Save yourselves." The psychological effect of Casimir's final transmission was exactly what he had calculated. Kapitänleutnant Kleist believed he was hearing the desperate last words of a radio operator facing capture, and the apparent order for other ships to stay away convinced him that the Americans were genuinely terrified of his presence. The U-boat commander decided to board the disabled merchantman and search her cargo manifest before sinking her, a decision that would keep his submarine on the surface for at least 15 minutes, while his boarding party explored the ship. This was exactly the opportunity that HMS Bramble needed to close the distance and execute the ramming attack that Lieutenant Commander Pierce had been planning since the deception began. The corvette's engines screamed at maximum power as she raced across the Atlantic swells, her bow cutting through the grey water like a knife blade aimed at the U-boat's hull. Aboard U-419, the German crew was focused entirely on preparing their boarding party and positioning their deck gun to threaten the merchantman's crew, never suspecting that a British warship was approaching at flank speed from their blind spot. The timing had to be perfect. If the corvette arrived too early, the submarine would dive and escape. Too late, and the U-boat's deck gunners would sink the Liberty Dawn, before the ramming attack could succeed. Casimir maintained his radio deception even as he watched the German boarding party preparing to cross to his ship, knowing that his performance was the only thing keeping 27 merchant vessels and their crews alive. The young cadet could see individual German sailors on the submarine's deck, close enough to make out the details of their uniforms and equipment. In that moment, he understood viscerally why merchant marine casualties were so high. These ships carried no armor, no heavy weapons, and no protection beyond the courage of their crews and the hope that naval escorts could keep the wolves at bay. But today, for the first time in the war, a merchant vessel was fighting back using the only weapon available to her: deception, timing, and the desperate courage of a 20-year-old Polish-American kid who refused to let his ship die without a fight. HMS Bramble struck U-419 amidships at 18 knots, her reinforced bow crushing the submarine's pressure hull like an aluminum can beneath a sledgehammer. The impact threw German sailors into the frigid Atlantic and sent a shockwave through both vessels that could be felt on ships 5 miles away. Kapitän-Leutnant Kleist had just enough time to order alarm dive before the corvette's ram tore through his command, flooding the submarine's control room and sealing the fate of 43 German submariners. U-419 went down in less than 4 minutes, her shattered hull unable to maintain buoyancy as thousands of gallons of seawater poured through the massive breach in her side. The ramming attack was so successful that it exceeded every expectation. Instead of simply damaging the submarine and forcing it to retreat, HMS Bramble had achieved the complete destruction of one of Germany's most experienced U-boat crews. But the victory came at a cost, as the corvette's bow was crushed in the collision, and she began taking on water through her forward compartments. Lieutenant Commander Pierce ordered emergency pumping operations and reduced speed to prevent further flooding, but his ship would require major repairs before she could resume convoy escort duties. The other submarines in the Wolf Pack, monitoring radio traffic from their submerged positions, heard U-419's final transmission and realized that something had gone terribly wrong with what should have been a routine attack on a disabled merchantman. The loss of an experienced submarine and crew to what appeared to be a merchant vessel's deception created confusion and hesitation among the remaining U-boat commanders, who suddenly questioned whether other helpless ships in the convoy might be setting similar traps. This psychological effect was exactly what naval strategists had hoped to achieve through commerce raider tactics, but no one had imagined that merchant mariners themselves would develop such innovative approaches to submarine warfare. Casimir Novak had just demonstrated that even unarmed cargo vessels could fight back against the U-boat menace, given sufficient courage and tactical creativity. The immediate aftermath of the ramming attack sent shockwaves through the remaining convoy as merchant sailors witnessed something unprecedented: a German submarine destroyed by surface action rather than depth charges or aircraft attack. Word of the Liberty Dawn's deception spread through the convoy's radio network, inspiring other merchant crews who had felt helpless against submarine attack for years of war. The psychological impact on convoy morale was tremendous, as sailors realized that they weren't simply passive targets waiting for naval protection, but could actively participate in their own defense through clever tactics and coordinated action with their escorts. Captain Morrison officially commended Casimir for his initiative and tactical innovation under extreme combat conditions, but the young cadet understood that his actions had violated numerous regulations and could easily result in court-martial proceedings after the convoy reached port. The use of false distress signals was prohibited under international maritime law, and military authorities might view his deception as a dangerous precedent that could undermine genuine rescue operations in the future. But the tactical success of the operation was undeniable. U-419 was confirmed destroyed with all hands, HMS Bramble had suffered damage but remained operational, and the convoy had lost no additional vessels since the ramming attack. More importantly, the remaining German submarines appeared to have lost their appetite for surface attacks, staying submerged and limiting their activities to long-range torpedo shots that proved far less effective than the coordinated Wolfpack tactics they had employed previously. Intelligence officers later confirmed that German Submarine Command had issued new directives warning U-boat crews about American deception tactics and ordering increased caution when approaching apparently disabled vessels. The fear and respect that merchant mariners had developed for U-boat crews was suddenly reciprocated, as German submarine commanders learned that even unarmed cargo ships could pose a deadly threat under the right circumstances. The rest of Convoy HX229 reached Liverpool on March 29, 1943, having lost only 14 vessels out of the original 43, a survival rate of 67% that exceeded expectations for convoys facing concentrated wolfpack attacks. Casimir's tactical innovation had prevented what naval intelligence estimated would have been the complete destruction of the convoy, saving approximately 29 merchant vessels and their crews totaling over 800 lives. The strategic implications extended far beyond a single convoy's survival, as word of the deception spread through the Merchant Marine Academy and influenced training programs for radio operators and deck officers. By late 1943, American merchant crews were being taught basic deception techniques and coordination procedures with naval escorts, transforming commerce protection from a purely defensive operation into an active partnership between merchant and naval forces. The psychological effect on German submarine operations was equally significant, as U-boat commanders became increasingly reluctant to surface near Allied shipping, reducing their effectiveness and contributing to the eventual victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. Official records show that submarine attacks on Allied convoys declined by 38% between April and December 1943, partly due to improved escort tactics, but significantly influenced by German fears of merchant vessel deception operations. Casimir himself received the Merchant Marine Distinguished Service Medal and a commendation from the British Admiralty, but more importantly, his actions had demonstrated that individual initiative and tactical creativity could change the course of naval warfare even when conventional military doctrine offered no solutions. The young Polish-American cadet had proven that heroes weren't just found in elite military units or among experienced officers, but could emerge from anywhere when ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances with courage and intelligence. Following his return to New York in April 1943, Casimir was promoted to third officer and assigned to advanced communications training at the Merchant Marine Academy's new tactical coordination program. His experience with radio deception had caught the attention of naval intelligence officers who recognized the potential for developing systematic deception techniques for use in convoy operations. The Academy created a special curriculum based on Casimir's innovations, teaching merchant radio operators how to coordinate with naval escorts in developing false distress scenarios and other tactical deceptions designed to lure submarines into vulnerable positions. These techniques proved so effective that they were incorporated into British and Canadian merchant marine training programs, spreading Casimir's tactical concepts throughout the Allied merchant fleets. By war's end, merchant vessels had used variations of the false distress tactic to destroy 17 German and 3 Japanese submarines, fundamentally altering the strategic balance in the Battle of the Atlantic and the Pacific submarine campaign. Naval historians would later credit these merchant marine tactical innovations with shortening the war by an estimated 6 months, as improved convoy survival rates accelerated the delivery of war materiel to European and Pacific theaters. But perhaps most importantly, Casimir's actions had restored confidence and fighting spirit to merchant sailors who had previously seen themselves as helpless victims of submarine warfare. The knowledge that they could fight back, even without heavy weapons or armor, transformed the psychological dynamic of convoy operations and contributed to the eventual Allied victory in the longest continuous campaign of World War II. After the war, Casimir returned to Pittsburgh and married Teresa Kowalski, a nurse he had met during his brief leave following the convoy action. They raised 4 children in the same South Side neighborhood where he had grown up, and Casimir worked for 32 years as a radio technician for Westinghouse Electric Corporation. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, preferring to focus on his family and community rather than dwelling on the violence he had witnessed in the Atlantic. His children learned about their father's heroism only when a British naval historian contacted him in 1978, researching a book about merchant marine contributions to Allied victory. The historian, Commander James Whitfield, had spent 3 years tracking down surviving crew members from Convoy HX229 and was amazed to discover that the tactical innovation that had saved the convoy was the product of a 20-year-old cadet's desperate improvisation rather than established military doctrine. Whitfield's interviews with Casimir revealed that the false distress tactic had been conceived and executed entirely without authorization from higher command, making it one of the most successful acts of individual initiative in naval history. The British historian's subsequent book, Merchants at War: The Unsung Heroes of the Atlantic Battle, brought international attention to Casimir's actions and sparked renewed interest in the merchant marine's combat role during World War II. Letters from surviving convoy members began arriving at the Novak family home, thanking Casimir for actions that had saved their lives 40 years earlier. Many of these correspondents had never known the identity of the radio operator whose deception had destroyed U-419, and their gratitude provided Casimir with a sense of closure he had never expected to find. Perhaps most touching was a letter from the widow of HMS Bramble's Lieutenant Commander Pierce, expressing her gratitude for a tactical partnership that had given her husband the opportunity to strike back against the submarines that had terrorized convoy escorts throughout the war. The tactical principles that Casimir pioneered during that desperate morning in March 1943 influenced naval doctrine for decades after World War II ended. Modern electronic warfare specialists study his deception techniques as early examples of information warfare, where psychological manipulation proved as effective as conventional weapons in achieving tactical objectives. The United States Naval Academy includes his case study in courses on tactical innovation and crisis decision-making, teaching future officers that individual initiative and creative thinking can overcome seemingly impossible odds when conventional approaches fail. Perhaps most significantly, Casimir's actions demonstrated that heroism doesn't require superhuman courage or elite training. Sometimes it emerges from ordinary people who simply refuse to accept defeat when lives are at stake. His willingness to violate regulations and risk court-martial in order to save his convoy reflected the moral courage that characterized America's citizen soldiers throughout World War II, men and women who understood that rules exist to serve principles rather than the reverse. The young cadet who had grown up in Pittsburgh's steel mills embodied the immigrant values of hard work, personal responsibility, and sacrifice for the common good that helped America prevail in its greatest military challenge. His parents' decision to emigrate from Poland had given their son the opportunity to serve his adopted country in its hour of greatest need, and Casimir's heroism reflected the contributions of millions of immigrant families who helped America win the war for democracy and freedom. In the broader context of World War II's Atlantic campaign, Casimir's tactical innovation represented a turning point in the psychological battle between Allied merchant crews and German submarine forces. For nearly 4 years, U-boat crews had enjoyed a significant psychological advantage over merchant sailors, who felt helpless against an invisible enemy that could strike without warning from the ocean's depths. The knowledge that merchant vessels could fight back using deception and coordination with escorts fundamentally altered this dynamic, giving Allied crews confidence and fighting spirit that sustained them through the war's final 2 years. Statistical analysis of convoy losses shows a marked improvement in merchant crew performance following the dissemination of tactical deception techniques, with faster damage control, more effective abandoned ship procedures, and better coordination with naval escorts. These improvements contributed directly to Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, as German submarine effectiveness declined even as U-boat construction reached its wartime peak. The strategic implications extended beyond maritime warfare, as successful convoy operations ensured the delivery of war material that made possible the D-Day invasion and subsequent Allied victory in Europe. Every tank, aircraft, and artillery shell that reached British ports represented a small victory in the global struggle against fascism, and Casimir's contribution to convoy protection helped ensure that American industrial production could reach the battlefields where it would determine the war's outcome. The legacy of Casimir Novak's heroism extends far beyond military history into the realm of moral philosophy and personal courage. His decision to violate established regulations in order to save lives raises fundamental questions about the relationship between legal authority and moral responsibility, particularly in crisis situations where conventional approaches offer no hope of success. Military discipline requires obedience to orders and adherence to established procedures, but Casimir's case demonstrates that blind obedience can sometimes become a form of moral cowardice when human lives are at stake. His willingness to accept personal responsibility for an unauthorized tactical innovation reflected the kind of moral courage that distinguishes true leadership from mere compliance with authority. The young cadet understood intuitively that rules exist to serve human welfare rather than abstract principles of order, and his actions embodied the democratic values for which America fought during World War II. In choosing innovation over obedience, creativity over conformity, and moral responsibility over legal safety, Casimir demonstrated the individual initiative and personal courage that characterized America's greatest generation. His story reminds us that heroism often emerges not from following orders, but from the willingness to break rules when human decency demands action beyond the scope of conventional authority. Modern merchant mariners continue to study Casimir's tactical innovation as an example of how individual creativity and moral courage can overcome seemingly impossible odds in crisis situations. The principles of deception, coordination, and tactical flexibility that he pioneered have been adapted for use in contemporary maritime security operations, where merchant vessels face threats from pirates, terrorists, and hostile state actors. His emphasis on coordination between merchant crews and naval escorts has influenced modern convoy protection procedures, and his willingness to accept personal responsibility for unauthorized actions serves as a model for junior officers facing ethical dilemmas in complex operational environments. Perhaps most importantly, Casimir's story demonstrates that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary results when they combine technical competence with moral courage and refuse to accept defeat in the face of overwhelming odds. His Polish-American background reminds us that America's strength has always come from the contributions of immigrant families who brought their values, skills, and determination to serve their adopted country in times of national crisis. The steel mills of Pittsburgh that shaped his character represented the industrial foundation that made American victory possible, while his parents' immigrant values of hard work and personal responsibility provided the moral foundation that guided his actions during the war's most dangerous moments. The broader implications of Casimir's heroism extend into contemporary discussions of military ethics, individual responsibility, and the moral obligations of citizens in democratic societies. His willingness to risk court-martial, rather than watch helplessly as German submarines destroyed his convoy, raises important questions about when legal compliance becomes morally insufficient and personal action becomes morally necessary. These questions remain relevant in modern contexts, where individuals must choose between following orders and protecting innocent lives, between legal safety and moral responsibility, between conformity and conscience. Casimir's story suggests that true patriotism sometimes requires disobedience to authority when that authority fails to protect the values and people it claims to serve. His tactical innovation succeeded not because it followed established doctrine, but because it challenged conventional thinking and demonstrated that creative approaches could achieve results that traditional methods could not deliver. The courage to challenge authority and propose alternative solutions represents a form of democratic leadership that remains essential in contemporary society, where complex problems often require innovative solutions that transcend conventional bureaucratic boundaries. As we reflect on Casimir Novak's extraordinary morning in the North Atlantic, we're confronted with profound questions about the nature of heroism and the responsibilities of citizenship in times of crisis. Would you have possessed the moral courage to violate regulations and risk court-martial in order to save the lives of strangers? Would you have trusted your own judgment over established authority when conventional approaches offered no hope of success? Could you have maintained your performance under the extreme pressure of knowing that thousands of lives depended on your ability to deceive a deadly enemy? These questions challenge us to examine our own capacity for moral leadership and personal responsibility when faced with seemingly impossible choices. Casimir's story reminds us that heroism isn't reserved for elite warriors or professional soldiers, but can emerge from anyone willing to combine technical competence with moral courage in service of the common good. His immigrant background and working-class origins demonstrate that America's greatest strength has always come from ordinary citizens who possess the extraordinary courage to act when action is needed most. The young Polish-American cadet who saved Convoy HX229 embodied the democratic values and individual initiative that enabled America to prevail in its greatest military challenge, proving that freedom's survival depends not on abstract principles, but on the concrete actions of real people willing to risk everything for what they believe is right. Share this story so others can understand what courage really means, and remember that the heroes of tomorrow are being shaped by the choices we make today.